Last week, we set aside our usual analysis work to dive headlong into the legends of the TR-3B, a giant black triangular aircraft the United States has allegedly been operating in total secrecy for decades. This week, we're going to dive into the confirmed and alleged government programs that could explain these sightings away, in our effort to finally get to the bottom of this long-standing mystery. The truth may be out there, but sometimes it can be awfully tough to find. I'm Alex Hollings, and this is Air Power. With stories continuing to dominate the media about UAP whistleblower David Grush and his claims that the United States has been secretly recovering and even operating alien craft for decades, now seemed like an appropriate time to dive in to the long-standing legend of the TR-3B. Now, if you're not already familiar with the legends of the TR-3B, these long-standing rumors all revolve around a massive black triangular craft that's said to be powered by a reverse-engineered alien anti-gravity propulsion drive. And while it's not usually my style to lend too much credence to these sorts of claims, this one is a little different for me. Because, as I explained in last week's episode, I personally saw something that I can't explain in the skies over Connecticut as a kid. Now, as I explained before, I don't expect anyone to believe in the TR-3B just because I saw a big black triangle in the sky. Nor am I convinced that this craft, if real, is powered by reverse-engineered alien technology. But in my cursory research on this topic, I came across a database of witness statements and testimonials, and to my absolute shock, I found a lot of common elements between these reports of black triangle UFOs, or in more modern parlance, UAP, in my own childhood experience. Now, to be clear, I don't consider that to be proof, but for me, that was impetus enough for me to want to try to sift through all the hyperbolic and conspiratorial static to try to discern the real truth about this story once and for all. Now, last week, we went through a meta-analysis conducted by the National Institute of Discovery Science into black triangle UFO sightings throughout the United States and determined that there was a significant uptick in these sorts of reports right around 1997. We also talked about some classified aircraft programs that we have since learned about and how alien they seemed, as well as the fact that the US Air Force had invested the equivalent of about $137 billion of today's dollars into classified acquisitions in the last few years of the 1980s. Now again, that's more than enough to buy 1,500 F-35As or to fund Russia's entire military for 2 years. It's only going to get weirder this week as we dive into contemporary reporting from the early 90s that suggests not only did this craft exist, but that it even deployed alongside the F-117 Nighthawk in Operation Desert Storm. We'll also discuss patents filed by the US Navy and others that may substantiate some parts of these claims, go over some first-hand witness accounts, and then we'll close by poking holes in the evidence we found, using deductive reasoning and contemporary context so that we can make sure the conclusions we draw are rational. But before we get started, I want to give you the same disclosure I did last week, that my research into this topic did not begin in good faith. I had every intention of dismissing the legends of the TR-3B as nonsense. And to give you the bottom line up front, the evidence I've collected has not turned me into a believer, but it has made me realize that I can't just dismiss this as nothing. There's something here, and it's worth exploring. So let's begin with what I feel may be the biggest shock to many of you. And that's how 32 years ago, news outlets were covering these secret triangular aircraft as though they were not only real, but flying combat missions alongside the F-117. That story begins in 1991, when Aviation Week published the first of 2 stories claiming that this classified black triangular aircraft, known to them as the TR-3A, had been designed and built by none other than Northrop, the same firm responsible for the B-2 Spirit and whose successor, Northrop Grumman, is now hard at work on the B-21 Raider, both of which, of course, are known for being groundbreaking stealth aircraft that leverage a flying wing design that does resemble a triangle. But unlike the B-2 Spirit, which wouldn't start flying until 1989 and wouldn't see service until 1997, this other classified Northrop Black Triangle aircraft is said to have begun development in 1976. That means it was in the works alongside Northrop's Tacit Blue program, as well as Lockheed's Have Blue, that of course would ultimately produce the F-117 Nighthawk. Now, according to Aviation Week's coverage, this program, known at the time as the Tactical High Altitude Penetrator, or THAP, was mature enough by 1978 for the U.S. Air Force to award Northrop a fixed-price research and development and demonstration/validation contract to build a prototype high-altitude reconnaissance aircraft based on their THAP proposal. That prototype, according to Aviation Week, made its first test flight in 1981, 8 years before the B-2 made its first test flight. And of course, that first test flight took place in the Groom Lake Dry Lake Bed facility that most of us know as Area 51. Now, again, I want to stress that this is all according to Aviation Week's reporting because they do not cite their sources. But per the coverage of William Scott at Aviation Week with research assistance by Joseph Jones, these test flights were going well enough by 1982 for Northrop to be awarded a production contract to build 25 to 30 of these aircraft. Now, many of these and other details we'll discuss soon were also found in a book called Stealth Technology, The Art of Black Magic, penned by that same Joseph Jones who supported this Aviation Week coverage, but that book also doesn't really cite direct sources. A few months later, Aviation Week would publish a second article about this aircraft, the Northrop TR-3A, saying that it was about 42 feet long, 14 feet high, and had a wingspan of between 60 and 65 feet. Now that would make its wingspan about 20 feet wider than the F-117, but still just about equal to the F-14 Tomcat when its wings weren't tucked, and that is a lot smaller than popular reports attributed to the TR-3B. Now that story also came with a bombshell. According to their, again, unnamed sources, these TR-3As, quote, may have been already deployed to Alaska, Britain, Panama, and Okinawa, as well as reportedly flying alongside the F-117 during combat operations over Baghdad in Desert Storm. Now, there's no hard evidence to substantiate any of this that I could find, but there are some interesting correlations I can draw. For instance, in August of 1989, Scottish oil exploration engineer Chris Gibson was working on an oil rig in the North Sea. Now, Gibson wasn't just an oil exploration engineer, he was also a trained airfield observer, and he reported seeing an isosceles triangle-shaped aircraft flying in formation with two F-111s and refueling from a KC-135. Now, this story is often attributed to reports of Aurora, but the time frame adds up for this instead to be the TR-3A. Again, that's assuming you believe Chris Gibson's claims and you believe Aviation Week's reporting. But what about Desert Storm? According to Aviation Week, the TR-3A, quote, may have been flying alongside the F-117 during combat operations over Iraq, serving as a laser designator or spotter aircraft for the F-117 to engage targets. Now, the F-117's claim to fame is leveraging these extremely precise laser-guided munitions, in particular, the GBU-27 Paveway 3, which was a laser-guided bunker-busting bomb designed specifically for the F-117 Nighthawk, and that proved so formidable during Desert Storm that airmen took to calling it the Hammer. In order to effectively leverage this weapon, the F-117 carries something called an Infrared Acquisition and Designation System, or IRADS. Now, this system was produced by Raytheon, and it includes a downward-facing infrared sensor with an integrated bore-sighted laser illuminator. This system is housed in a recess in the F-117's fuselage just to the right of the nose landing gear, but that recess is then covered by a radar-absorbent material mesh screen to make sure that it doesn't compromise its stealth. Now, one could argue that the F-117 pilot's job would be made a whole lot easier if another stealth aircraft was providing that laser target data, though by now it is extremely evident that the F-117 can indeed do this job on its own. But for the sake of argument, let's say the TR-3A really was flying ahead of the F-117 to provide intelligence, surveillance, and reconnaissance support. Well, that could possibly help explain why documents provided to Iraqi fighter pilots to help them identify the F-117 also showed the profile of the B-2 Spirit. Now, this does require a logical leap, so bear with me. If Iraqi service personnel saw the F-117 and this other Northrop-sourced flying wing black triangle operating in the same airspace, they may have mistook the two platforms as one and attributed this unusual profile to the Nighthawk. But to be totally honest with you, that's a bit of a stretch for me. But later that same year, in 1991, this concept of the TR-3A secretly operating alongside the F-117 in combat got some very cool new graphics associated with it, thanks to a popular mechanics cover story called America's New Secret Aircraft. Now, this story also discusses Northrop's TR-3A, alongside other undisclosed but reportedly seen aircraft, like another boomerang-shaped platform said to be completely silent and boasting a massive wingspan that stretched between 600 and 800 feet. Now, that would be 4 times the wingspan of the B-52 Stratofortress, and much more in keeping with popular claims associated with the TR-3B. Now, like Aviation Week, Popular Mechanics Reporting also claimed this TR-3A was significantly quieter than other aircraft, but they did not describe it as silent. Now, so far, all of this coverage has been attributed to eyewitness sightings or to anonymous sources, but in 1993, that would all change. And that's thanks to a radio enthusiast and airplane spotter extraordinaire named Steve Douglas. Now, Douglas was tracking F-15s and B-1B Lancers participating in air combat exercises over White Sands Missile Range in New Mexico when he heard and spotted something a whole lot more unusual. He ran and grabbed his camera and pointed it up at the sky just in time to capture 7 seconds of grainy zoomed-in footage of a very strange triangular aircraft. This craft, Douglas says, was the legendary TR-3A. According to an interview with Douglas at the time, this ray-shaped triangular aircraft was slower than the supersonic Eagles and Lancers that were flying around, and it produced a very different sound. The grainy footage supports his claims, showing a black triangle that looks sort of like a mix between a B-2 Spirit, which was in testing at the time, and the McDonnell Douglas A-12 Avenger II. That aircraft, of course, is also known as the Flying Dorito, and it had reportedly been canceled just 2 years prior. Now, when I said Douglas was a prolific plane spotter, I meant it, and believe it or not, this wasn't the last time he would get incredible pictures of a very unusual looking triangular aircraft. Over 2 decades later, in March of 2014, Douglas, Dean Musket, and a number of other plane spotters were taking pictures of the sky over Amarillo, Texas, when they saw what looked like a formation of 3 high-flying B-2 Spirits. Douglas and others snapped a bunch of pictures, but it wasn't until later, when they were able to zoom in, that they realized they weren't looking at B-2s at all. Now, to this day, no one has a conclusive answer for what Douglas filmed in 1993 or photographed in 2014. But as luck would have it, Douglas found me on Twitter, and we have a call scheduled for tomorrow evening. I'm hoping he can shed some kind of light on this topic. But even if he can, we're still talking about the TR-3A, which is a pretty grounded tale about a stealthy reconnaissance platform designed and operated in secret alongside known classified stealth programs. But this whole story gets way weirder when you start looking into the claims associated with the TR-3B instead. You see, unlike the allegedly turbojet-powered TR-3A, the TR-3B is supposedly powered by a reverse-engineered anti-gravity drive made from technology recovered from a crashed alien spacecraft. You can find lots of claims all over the internet about the TR-3B's anti-gravity drive, most of which include using nuclear power to rotate highly pressurized mercury to produce plasma, and, in turn, a gravitational field. And like so many of these stories, most of these claims ultimately draw back to Operation Paperclip, the program that saw the United States absorb more than 1,500 German scientists, researchers, and engineers after World War II to have them continue work on various defense technologies. Now, we've already discussed in the past how myths about advanced Nazi weapons were born in the years after World War II, and tales of this anti-gravity powered TR-3B are no exception. But despite how silly these stories sound, there is some evidence to substantiate parts of these claims. An anti-gravity drive of the sort believers say powers the TR-3B would require huge levels of power production, more than anything we could do with today's technology. But then, Lockheed Martin does have a patent filed for a containerized cold fusion reactor that they themselves claim could power an aircraft. In fact, they say it would fit inside the fuselage of an F-16. And that's far from the only patent that's possibly associated with this concept. By far, the most famous has to be the patent awarded in 2004 to an inventor named John St. Clair. Now, this patent, titled Triangular Spacecraft, includes images that look a lot like people claim the TR-3B looks like. And the claims associated with this patent say this craft would operate just like how people say the TR-3B operates. But I'm gonna tell you guys the truth. I don't buy John St. Clair's work. This guy has filed a bunch of patents that sound like they should break science as we know it. Things like full-body teleportation systems, a hyperspace energy generator, a remote viewing amplifier, a magnetic vortex wormhole generator, and a hyperspace torque generator, among a bunch of others. And yet, despite the fact that this guy's work is so groundbreaking, you won't find a single peer-reviewed paper. And in fact, most of his patents are listed as abandoned. The truth is, St. Clair isn't even the first guy to come up with the idea of trying to patent UFOs. Thomas Townsend Brown was doing it all the way back in the 1930s. And of course, in both cases, nothing ever came of these patents. But not every patent associated with TR-3B-like technology is so easy to dismiss. In fact, some are downright interesting, like the work of one Dr. Salvatore Pais, who didn't file his patents alone. No, he filed his with the US Navy. In 2016, Pais filed the first of a series of extremely unusual new patents pertaining to just the sort of science fiction-like technology that's often found in claims about the TR-3B. These patents cover a whole range of topics, from gravitational wave generators to space-time modification weapons. Now, according to Pais's official biography, he spent time working as a NASA graduate research fellow before he became an advanced concepts analyst for Northrop Grumman, the same firm, of course, that's been claimed to be behind the TR-3A. Pais then went on to the Department of the Navy's Strategic Systems Program, and according to some news outlets, he now works with the US Space Force. Now, I was able to confirm that the US Navy invested at least $466,000 into Pais's work since 2017, and a lot of that work has been made public in the form of 3 patents filed by the Navy, with Pais listed as the inventor, the most famous of which is titled Craft Using an Inertial Mass Reduction Device. A lot of this technology revolves around a plasma compression fusion device that, according to a declassified Navy presentation, can, quote, lead to the development of a space-time modification weapon, a weapon that can make the hydrogen bomb seem more like a firecracker. Those are their words, not mine. Now, if you're raising a skeptical eyebrow by now, I don't blame you, because I'm skeptical too. But Pais does have some noteworthy supporters, including the Chief Technology Officer for the U.S. Naval Aviation Enterprise, Dr. James Sheehy. I'll quote him here. China is already investing significantly in this area, and we would prefer the US hold the patent as opposed to paying forever more to use this revolutionary technology. He went on to say, this will become a reality. But there are also some red flags here that may point to an information or even a psychological operation. For instance, the fact that we can see these patents at all. The US military has reserved the right to file patents that are not available for public viewing since the Invention Secrecy Act of 1951. The fact that we can even see these patents suggests that the Navy wanted an audience, and based on Sheely's quotes, it seems as though that audience may have been China. But to tell you the truth, whether or not these patents reflect a real technology that may one day work, or a psychological operation aimed at China, is something I just couldn't say. So now we need to try to draw some conclusions with the evidence that we have, and what that means is poking holes in our evidence until we're left with only the most rational of conclusions. We'll start with those articles in Aviation Week that so authoritatively relayed the story of the TR-3A's classified development. Those stories included no real sourcing, and they were both penned by or with the support of a journalist named William Scott, who is now known for sometimes getting a little too excited about the unusual topics that he covered, resulting in some serious but probably unintentional stretching of the truth. In 1990, for instance, he reported that the US had a secret hypersonic bomber that could launch nuclear weapons from vertical launch tubes. That aircraft, of course, also never manifested. The TR-3 designation, many now believe, was actually the result of Scott simply mishearing stories about Tier 3, which was a real program that followed the very real Tier 2. Tier 2 ultimately resulted in fielding the Global Hawk drone. Tier 3 was supposed to be an unmanned SR-71 successor that was also known as Quartz, but that ultimately didn't make it beyond the design stage. Now, elements of that Tier 3 program, later known as Tier 3-, did ultimately result in Lockheed and Boeing building the Dark Star, but not the one that you think. This Dark Star flew in 1996 and was a subsonic ISR drone. But what about that popular mechanics coverage? Well, if you go back and read it in full, most coverage associated with the TR-3A directly cites Scott's reporting in Aviation Week. Now, most people, including me, were struck by the details reported by Aviation Week because it's a well-respected outlet with a history of having insider information. But the outlet also has a pretty well-recorded history of publishing some less than factual accounts of black aircraft programs over the years. We just only remember the ones they got right. The work of Dr. Salvatore Pais may ultimately yield incredible results, but for now, there isn't much evidence to substantiate his claims, and within the scientific community, he does have his fair share of skeptics. Carl Willis, for example, is a nuclear engineer and reactor supervisor at the University of New Mexico. He's also currently under contract with the US Army developing a dense plasma focus fusion neutron power source. Try saying that 10 times fast. But it's safe to say, Willis knows what he's talking about. And in an interview he did with the War Zone, he said that Pais's work, quote, contains invented jargon, nonsensical statements, weak or absent evidence of an informed theoretical basis, an overabundance of nebulous adjectives and adverbs instead of meaningful quantities in technical writing. He went on to say that Pais's work has lots of statements made in passing that seem to contradict basic and accepted physics. In other words, even Pais's patents may not be the anti-gravity smoking gun that we're looking for. But what does all this mean for the legends of this TR-3B or TR-3A or Manta or Astra, this giant black triangle that I and many others have reported seeing over the years? The truth is, there's very little, if any, evidence to suggest that this platform exists in any form, whether we're talking about a down-to-earth turbojet-powered stealth triangle or a reverse-engineered alien spacecraft. But that doesn't mean that hundreds or now thousands of people are lying when they say they see something strange in the sky. Now, I have to acknowledge my own hypocrisy because I've personally been dismissive of lots of eyewitness claims about unusual objects in the sky when they don't jive with my understanding of reality. But how can I be dismissive when I'm the eyewitness? The hard truth is, whatever these triangles were or are remains a mystery to me, but I genuinely believe that this is a mystery that has an answer buried somewhere deep in a Defense Department line of accounting. For every F-117 Nighthawk that goes on to change the world, there's a long list of platforms that are designed, built, and tested, but never quite make it into production. Sometimes their technology is too forward-leaning to be cost-effective. Sometimes it just doesn't work at all. But sometimes, like in the case of the stealth Blackhawks used in 2011 for the Osama bin Laden raid, or the 2009 reports of the Beast of Kandahar that later proved to be Lockheed Martin's RQ-170. Another big black triangle in the sky. Sometimes, a small group of highly classified and supremely capable platforms manage to not just exist, but to operate right beneath our noses for years before we ever can confirm that they even exist. I honestly still don't know what I saw in the sky that night over Torrington, Connecticut, or what more than 700 other people reported seeing all throughout the 80s and 90s. But after spending my entire professional life peeking behind that classified veil, I can say with enough confidence to satiate my own curiosity that whatever it was probably American in origin. It could have been a stealth aircraft, or it could have been a stealth blimp, like the 69-foot prototype that an engineer named Carter Ward built for the Navy back in 1990. It could have been all kinds of things, but the only thing I can say for sure now is the one thing I went into this story hoping I could eliminate. And that's that the 10-year-old me I've been dismissing for almost 30 years really did see something strange in the sky that night. Other people saw it too, and whatever it was real. Maybe someday we'll get to know what to call it when its file gets declassified. And with that ends yet another edition of Air Power from Sandboxx News. I'm Alex Hollings. Make sure to swing by sandboxnews.com today and every day for all the latest in news, entertainment, and motivation from all around the force. If you got anything out of today's video, make sure to click like and subscribe down below and leave me a comment so I know what I should cover next. And of course, don't forget to tap on that bell icon so you never miss a drop from Sandboxx News.